My name is Naomi, exactly, 33 years old, and I am a forensic accountant who destroys financial criminals for a living. 6 months ago, I sat quietly in the third row of our family church and watched my parents stand at the altar holding hands and crying tears of joy. They proudly announced to 300 clapping parishioners that they had just secured a $1 million commercial loan to open a luxury restaurant for my younger sister. The crowd cheered, the pastor smiled, and my parents publicly thanked me for generously risking my own credit to co-sign the massive debt and make their dream come true. There was just one massive problem with this beautiful announcement. I had never seen a loan application. I had never signed a single piece of paper. My own parents had just committed federal identity theft and wire fraud against me, right in front of the entire congregation. But I did not scream. I did not run up to the altar and expose them. I just smiled, clapped my hands, and waited until they signed a 10-year commercial lease. If you are watching this and have ever had your trust weaponized by the people who share your blood, hit that like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. You are going to want to hear exactly how I used the law to systematically dismantle their lives. It started on a perfectly normal Sunday morning in Atlanta. The church was packed to capacity, the morning light streaming through the stained glass windows, casting warm, colorful reflections across the wooden pews. Pastor Williams had just finished a stirring sermon about community and supporting one another when my father Thomas and my mother Barbara stepped up to the podium. They had asked for a special moment to share a blessing with the congregation. I was sitting in the third row, completely unaware that the ground beneath my feet was about to be ripped away. I watched my parents adjust the microphone. They wore their best Sunday clothes, projecting the image of a successful, pious couple. My father cleared his throat, looking out over the sea of familiar faces. "We want to thank the Lord," my father said, his voice booming over the speakers thick with fake humility, "for blessing our family today with the means to open a fine dining establishment that our youngest daughter Alyssa has always been praying for." The congregation erupted into thunderous applause. My sister Alyssa, who is 29 years old, stood up from the front row, wiping away dramatic, perfectly timed tears. She was wearing a designer dress that I knew for a fact she could not afford. Beside her stood her husband Jamal. Jamal is a 31-year-old African-American man who loved referring to himself as a serial entrepreneur and a future culinary CEO. In reality, he was a guy who wore tailored suits purchased on credit and had run 3 separate business ventures straight into the ground. But today, he stood tall, puffing out his chest and waving to the clapping crowd like he was a visiting dignitary. Then my mother took the microphone. She looked directly at me, her eyes shining with what everyone else thought was maternal pride. "And we could not have secured this $1 million commercial loan without the selfless, generous backing of our eldest daughter, Naomi," she declared. She believed in her sister's vision so much that she co-signed the loan, putting her own pristine credit on the line to make this family dream a reality. All eyes turned to me. 300 people were clapping, smiling, and nodding at my supposed generosity. My heart physically stopped beating for a second. The blood drained from my face, leaving a cold, sharp ringing in my ears. The world around me seemed to slow down completely. I am a forensic accountant for a major financial firm. My entire career is built on tracking money laundering, unmasking corporate fraud, and auditing complex financial trails. I protect my credit score like it is a vital organ, because in my line of work, your financial reputation is everything. In a fraction of a second, my professional brain compartmentalized the sheer terror and processed the cold, hard facts. Thomas and Barbara had not just told a lie to look good in front of their church friends. They had committed a severe federal crime. To secure a commercial loan of that magnitude, they would have needed my social security number, my tax returns, my banking history, and my physical signature. They had forged my identity. I could have stood up right then. I could have shouted that they were lying. I could have marched up to that podium, grabbed the microphone from my mother's hands, and demanded the truth in front of everyone. But as a forensic accountant, I know one thing above all else. If you spook a fraudster before the ink is dry, they hide the money, they run, they shift the blame. If I caused a scene now, they would play the victims. They would claim it was a misunderstanding or a clerical error by the bank. I needed them to feel invincible. I needed them to spend the money. I needed them to sign the commercial lease and tie themselves legally and irrevocably to the fraud. So I did the hardest thing I have ever done in my entire life. I stood up, forced a bright, loving smile onto my face, and waved at the clapping congregation. I let them applaud my supposed generosity. I let my mother blow me a kiss from the altar. Internally, I was already drafting the federal subpoenas and planning my visit to the FBI. The service finally concluded, and the organ music swelled through the sanctuary. I remained standing in the pew, maintaining my perfect supportive smile, while the countdown to their absolute inevitable destruction silently began. As the aisles began to clear, and the congregation funneled toward the double doors, I was immediately swarmed by well-wishers. People I had known since childhood patted my shoulder and squeezed my hands. Mrs. Higgins, the choir director who had known me since I was 7 years old, pulled me into a tight embrace. "You are such a good sister, Naomi," she told me, her eyes brimming with genuine emotion. "Not many people would risk $1 million for their sibling. You have a heart of pure gold." "Family is everything, Mrs. Higgins," I replied smoothly. My voice was remarkably steady, betraying none of the absolute panic and rage boiling inside my chest. I smiled at her, maintaining perfect eye contact. I watched my own hands pat her, marveling at how detached my body felt from my brain. My mind was currently running a high-speed diagnostic on federal banking regulations. A commercial loan of $1 million, backed by the Small Business Administration, requires rigorous underwriting. It requires tax transcripts directly from the IRS. It requires a hard credit pull, a personal financial statement, and a wet signature, or a verified digital footprint. As I slowly made my way toward the church lobby, I analyzed the logistics of their crime. How did they bypass the strict verification regulations? Then it hit me. I had lived with my parents until I was 25. A dusty metal filing cabinet in their basement still held boxes of my old college paperwork, including expired passports, old tax forms, and financial returns from my early 20s. They had the foundational documents. But what about the verification calls? What about the email confirmations? They must have created a synthetic digital identity. They likely resurrected an old email address I no longer monitored and purchased a prepaid phone to intercept the underwriting department's verification calls. It was a masterpiece of domestic betrayal. I stepped into the crowded foyer and spotted Jamal holding court near the entrance. He was strutting across the polished marble floor, shaking hands and accepting congratulations, as if he had just cured a major disease. He caught my eye over the heads of the crowd and gave me a slick, arrogant nod. He did not look like a man who had just committed a felony. He looked like a man who believed he was untouchable. Alyssa was standing a few feet away, entirely engrossed in showing the pastor's wife expensive fabric swatches for the restaurant seating. She was gesturing wildly, talking about velvet upholstery and imported Italian lighting fixtures. My parents were standing by the main doors, glowing under the admiration of their peers. My father puffed out his chest while receiving a firm handshake from a local city councilman. My mother was touching her pearl necklace, accepting compliments with practiced humility. They truly believed they had gotten away with it. They thought because I was the quiet, responsible, boring older sister, I would just absorb this massive liability. They assumed I would be too terrified of public embarrassment to blow the whistle on my own family. They severely underestimated exactly what kind of monster they had created by forcing me to be the responsible one my entire life. My mother finally spotted me and broke away from her conversation. "Naomi, sweetie," she called out, pulling me into a suffocating hug. The heavy scent of her floral perfume made me want to gag. "Thank you for not making a fuss when we announced it. We wanted it to be a surprise. I know you like to fly under the radar, but we just had to give you the credit you deserve." "It was definitely a surprise, Mom," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level. I stepped back from the embrace, ensuring my expression remained pleasant. "I just cannot believe you managed to pull all of the paperwork together without me noticing." My father stepped up beside her, wrapping a heavy arm around my shoulders. "Well, you know your mother." "Mother," he chuckled, squeezing my arm. "She is thorough. We handled all the tedious administrative details so you would not have to stress about it. You just focus on your little spreadsheets at work and let Jamal handle building the family empire. The sheer audacity of his statement almost made my knees buckle. They were openly mocking my profession while simultaneously using the pristine financial standing that my profession required. I looked at their smiling faces and made a silent vow. If I fought them right now in the middle of this church lobby, they would panic. Jamal would likely wire the funds to an offshore account or pull the cash out and disappear. My parents would claim it was a misunderstanding, hire a defense attorney, and tie me up in civil litigation for years while my credit score burned to ashes. I needed the federal government to destroy them, not me. I needed the FBI and the Bank Fraud Division to build a case so airtight that none of them would ever see the outside of a federal penitentiary. To do that, I needed them to commit the funds to hard assets. I needed them to sign the 10-year commercial lease. I needed them to cross state lines with the money-triggering wire fraud statutes. I needed them to feel completely, utterly safe. "We are hosting a celebration dinner tonight at the steakhouse downtown," my father announced, dropping his arm from my shoulders. "You are coming, of course. We need our primary investor there to toast the new venture." I looked at Jamal, who was now laughing loudly with a group of deacons entirely unaware that he was standing on a trap door. I looked at Alyssa, who was planning a luxury interior design on my stolen dime. And I looked at my parents, who had sacrificed my future on the altar of their own vanity. "I would not miss it for the world," I replied. I walked out of the church doors, stepped into the bright Atlanta sunlight, and headed toward my car. The performance had officially begun. I just had to survive the celebratory dinner tonight without letting them see the executioner hiding behind my eyes. That evening, the upscale steakhouse downtown buzzed with clinking crystal and hushed conversations. My parents booked a private dining room enclosed by heavy velvet curtains. I arrived exactly on time in my neutral gray work suit, choosing an outfit that let me fade into the background. I sat quietly at the corner of the table sipping water. Alyssa and Jamal arrived 30 minutes late, demanding attention. Alyssa draped herself in a silk designer gown, clutching a new handbag costing more than my monthly mortgage. Jamal strutted behind her in a tailored suit and a flashy gold watch. I knew their credit card limits could not support a single item they wore. They were burning through my stolen money, parading it like a victory lap. "Here is to the new empire," Jamal announced loudly the moment the waiter poured the champagne. He raised his glass high. "We are about to change the culinary landscape of Atlanta. No more working for the man. We are the man now." My father chuckled, raising his glass in agreement. "To Alyssa and Jamal, visionaries who are finally getting what they deserve." I clinked my glass against my mother's flute, maintaining my frozen smile. As waiters brought out dry-aged steaks, the conversation devolved into pure delusion. Alyssa spent 20 minutes detailing plans for the VIP lounge, outlining how she intended to import custom Italian marble. Jamal interrupted to brag about the celebrity chefs he planned to poach, speaking in corporate buzzwords like synergy, market disruption, and vertical integration. I sat quietly, cutting my steak into small, precise pieces. I waited for a brief lull in their self-congratulatory chatter before speaking up. "So, Jamal," I said casually, $1 million is a massive undertaking for a first-time restaurant venture. What is your financial breakdown for the operational capital versus the physical build-out?" Jamal stopped chewing. He scoffed, waving his fork at me dismissively. "Naomi, please, do not bore us with bean counting tonight. That is why you sit in a gray cubicle all day, and we are out here building generational wealth. You just handle the spreadsheets, I handle the vision." My father leaned back, laughing loudly at Jamal's blatant disrespect. "Jamal is right, Naomi," my father said, pointing a butter knife at me. "You have always been too rigid. You need to learn how to take actual risks. That is how real money is made." "Taking risks with whose money, Dad?" I asked. The table went uncomfortably silent for a split second. The clinking of silverware stopped entirely. Jamal narrowed his eyes and Alyssa shifted in her seat. I held my breath, wondering if I had pushed too far. My mother jumped in to shatter the tension. Her tone was laced with that familiar syrupy condescension she had perfected over 30 years of manipulating our dynamics. "Now, Naomi, do not ruin the mood," she chided gently, reaching over to pat my hand. You know Alyssa has been struggling to find her true calling for years. Jamal has had bad luck with his other ventures. This loan is exactly the fresh start they need. You should be honored your good credit could serve the family in such a meaningful way. Honored, I repeated softly, letting the word hang in the air. Absolutely, Alyssa chimed in, swirling the expensive red wine in her glass. She looked at me with pure, unfiltered entitlement. I mean, let us be honest here. What else were you going to do with that perfect credit score, Naomi? Buy another sensible sedan. Put more money into your retirement accounts. You are 33 and single. You do not have a family to build for. We do. Jamal and I are creating a lasting legacy. The sheer audacity of her statement was suffocating. She genuinely believed because I did not have a husband or children. My identity, my financial security, and my professional standing were simply excess resources meant for her consumption. They convinced themselves stealing from me was not a crime but a moral right. Jamal leaned across the table, a smug, greasy grin plastered across his face. Look, Naomi, I know you are just a corporate drone who does not understand high-level business mechanics. But when the restaurant franchises across the state, I will hire you to do our corporate taxes. I will even give you a family discount on your accounting retainer. He threw his head back and laughed at his own joke. My father joined in slapping the table while my mother giggled behind her napkin. Alyssa beamed at her husband, enjoying my public humiliation. I looked at these people. I looked at the parents who raised me, the sister I shared a bedroom with for 18 years, and the brother-in-law who repeatedly mocked my work ethic. The last remaining shred of familial loyalty inside my chest withered and died. I realized they did not see me as a human being. I was nothing more than a utility. I was a limitless resource to be extracted, drained, and discarded the moment I was no longer useful to their grand narrative. I picked up my water glass, raising it toward the center of the table. I cannot wait to see how it all turns out, I said, making sure my voice carried over their laughter. I am absolutely sure it will be unforgettable. I let them enjoy their expensive desserts, citing an early morning budget meeting at my firm as my excuse to leave. I paid for my sparkling water at the front desk, refusing to let them put it on the stolen tab. The moment the valet handed me the keys to my sensible sedan, the compliant facade dropped. My hands were shaking violently. I could barely grip the steering wheel. I locked the doors, turned the key, and drove home in absolute silence, the reality of their betrayal settling heavy and permanent in my chest. The streetlights of downtown Atlanta blurred past my windshield as I navigated the evening traffic. The silence inside my sensible sedan was deafening, leaving me trapped with the echoing memory of Jamal's mocking laughter. A corporate drone, a bean counter. That was how the man who had just stolen my identity justified his crime to my face. The sheer audacity of a man with absolutely zero financial literacy, looking a certified forensic accountant in the eye, and lecturing her about generational wealth would have been comical if it were not so devastating. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, methodically dissecting every word spoken at that toxic dinner table. Jamal was not a visionary. He was a textbook financial liability wrapped in a cheap suit. I knew exactly who he was because I had quietly investigated him 2 years ago. At the time, he and Alyssa had invited me to a coffee shop to pitch a revolutionary logistics app. Jamal had asked me for a $50,000 personal loan to fund the beta development. He slid a poorly formatted business plan across the table, entirely composed of buzzwords and empty promises. As a professional who audits corporate fraud, I did not just read his proposal, I ran a comprehensive background check. What I found was a graveyard of financial ruin. Jamal had 3 previous bankruptcies. He had a failed mobile detailing business that ended in a lawsuit for unpaid wages. He had a dropshipping company that resulted in thousands of dollars in vendor liens. His personal credit score hovered around a dismal 512. He was a financial black hole. When I firmly denied his loan request and advised him to seek traditional venture capital, Jamal threw a massive tantrum in the middle of the cafe, calling me a jealous, narrow-minded spinster. I expected my parents to defend me. Instead, Thomas and Barbara orchestrated an intervention at their house the following week to confront my selfishness. I remember standing in their living room while my father pointed a scolding finger at my chest. Family invests in family, Naomi, my father had yelled. You have money sitting in savings doing nothing. Jamal is trying to build an empire for your sister. My mother had wept those familiar manipulative tears, accusing me of being secretly envious that Alyssa had found a husband with such incredible ambition. They enabled Jamal's blatant disrespect because he sold them the exact fantasy they desperately wanted to buy. My parents craved status. They wanted to sit in the front pews of our church and be recognized as local elites. Jamal spoke loudly about acquiring wealth, and they confused his loud voice with actual competence. They chose to validate his delusions rather than accept the hard, boring reality of financial responsibility. And then there was Alyssa, the golden child. Alyssa had never been required to work for a single thing in her entire life. When she was 18 years old, she totaled a brand new Honda Civic because she was texting while driving. My parents did not punish her. Instead, they drained their emergency savings to purchase her a luxury Lexus SUV because they claimed she needed a safe, reliable vehicle for her upcoming college commute. Alyssa dropped out of that college exactly 2 semesters later, complaining that the professors were entirely too demanding. Meanwhile, I graduated summa cum laude from a state university. I paid my own tuition by working grueling night shifts as a data entry clerk. I missed parties, I skipped vacations, and I built my credit score point by agonizing point. When my graduation day finally arrived, my parents did not attend the ceremony. Alyssa was going through a minor breakup with a boyfriend of 3 months, and my mother claimed Alyssa was far too emotionally fragile to be left alone. I walked across the graduation stage to the sound of polite applause from strangers. My parents had spent 3 decades conditioning me to be the invisible infrastructure of our family. They trained me to believe that my role was to be the sturdy, uncomplaining safety net, while Alyssa got to be the star. You are the strong one, Naomi, my mother would always say, whenever she needed me to sacrifice my own needs. Alyssa is sensitive. Alyssa needs a village. I was never treated as a daughter who deserved protection. I was treated as a utility. I pulled into the parking garage of my apartment complex, the stark concrete walls grounding me in reality. I parked my car, turned off the ignition, and sat in the dark for a long time. The contrast between my quiet, disciplined life and their loud, stolen luxury was sickening. I lived within my means. I monitored my accounts. I followed the law. They despised me for my stability, viewing my quiet success as a direct insult to their chaotic failures. I stepped out of the car, rode the elevator to the 5th floor, and unlocked the door to my apartment. I dropped my keys onto the granite kitchen counter and stared into the empty living room. Alyssa's cruel words from the steakhouse echoed in my mind again. You are 33 and single. You do not have a family to build for. We do. They had completely dehumanized me. They rationalized stealing $1 million in my name because my uterus was empty and my ring finger was bare. In their twisted, narcissistic minds, my immaculate credit score and my financial stability were simply unassigned capital waiting for them to claim. They believed that because I did not fit their definition of a complete woman, my identity belonged to the family collective. As I walked toward my home office, the burning rage in my chest began to solidify into absolute freezing ice. Forensic accounting is not just a profession, it is a fundamental mindset. Fraudsters always make mistakes because their arrogance makes them incredibly sloppy. They believe they are the smartest people in the room, which blinds them to the digital footprints they leave behind. Jamal and Alyssa were the most arrogant people I knew, enabled by parents who believed they were above the law. They would leave a trail a mile wide. I walked over to my desk, booted up my secure laptop, and set my alarm for 6 o'clock the next morning. The grieving, betrayed daughter was officially dead. The forensic auditor was taking over. Tomorrow the investigation begins. The alarm was set for 6 o'clock, but sleep was a luxury I could not afford. I sat in the blue glow of my laptop screen, opening a hidden encrypted folder on my hard drive. I had labeled it with my sister and brother-in-law's names 2 years ago, right after that disastrous cafe meeting. Forensic accounting requires understanding the baseline behavior of a target. To understand how they escalated to $1 million federal bank fraud, I needed to review the exact anatomy of their financial ruin. The digital files staring back at me painted a horrifying picture of unchecked entitlement. Let us start with Alyssa. My parents had spent nearly 3 decades cultivating her severe financial dysmorphia. When I moved out at 22, I took nothing but my clothes and a cheap mattress. When Alyssa turned 22, she demanded an entire apartment refurnished with high-end modern pieces. Thomas and Barbara gladly swiped their credit cards to make her happy. But the true catalyst for their current desperation was Alyssa and Jamal's wedding 3 years ago. Jamal had proposed with a massive gaudy diamond ring. I later discovered through a simple public records search that the jeweler had sued him for defaulting on the financing plan. But Alyssa did not care about the reality of the debt. She only cared about the optics. She demanded a wedding that rivaled a royal coronation. She wanted a historic venue, a custom designer gown, and a towering floral archway. When Jamal inevitably could not produce a single cent to contribute, my parents stepped in to absorb the massive financial blow. Thomas and Barbara took out a second mortgage on their home to fund a $90,000 wedding. They drained their retirement accounts, so Alyssa could have a horse-drawn carriage and a 5-tier cake. I had refused to contribute financially to the wedding, which resulted in my mother calling me a bitter, unsupportive sibling. I attended the ceremony in a simple dress, watching my parents mortgage their future so Jamal could sip premium champagne and play the role of a wealthy groom. That wedding was the turning point. It cemented Jamal's belief that my parents were a bottomless ATM, and it solidified Alyssa's delusion that she deserved a lifestyle completely divorced from actual labor. After the honeymoon, Jamal's grifter mentality kicked into high gear. He convinced my father to invest $20,000 into a luxury mobile car detailing business. Jamal leased 3 high-end vans, purchased commercial-grade pressure washers, and hired a team of workers. The problem was that Jamal refused to actually work. He wanted to be the visionary CEO who gave orders from a rented downtown office space. Within 4 months, the business collapsed. He failed to pay his employees, resulting in a labor dispute that drained the remaining capital. The leasing company repossessed the vans, leaving my father permanently on the hook for the $20,000 commercial loan. But Jamal did not stop there. His next grand venture was a dropshipping empire. He maxed out 3 different business credit cards in Alyssa's name to purchase bulk electronics from overseas suppliers. When the shipment arrived, half the inventory was defective, and the other half violated trademark laws. Payment processors flagged his merchant accounts for excessive chargebacks, effectively blacklisting him from major financial platforms. He tanked Alyssa's credit score so thoroughly that she was denied a basic auto loan a year later. This historical data was the missing puzzle piece that explained the events of this morning. It explained why they needed me. They did not just want my pristine credit score. They absolutely required it because their own financial profiles were radioactive. Thomas and Barbara had overextended themselves with the second mortgage from the wedding and the defaulted car detailing loan. Their debt-to-income ratio was catastrophic. If my father walked into a bank and asked for $1 million commercial loan, the underwriting software would automatically reject him in seconds. Jamal was a known financial liability, with 3 bankruptcies and a trail of unpaid vendors. Alyssa had a gutted credit profile thanks to the dropshipping disaster. I was the only person in our entire extended family with a credit score above 800. I had 0 debt, a substantial 6-figure salary, a spotless banking history, and a portfolio of conservative investments. To a bank's automated underwriting algorithm, my profile represented 0 risk. I was the perfect host for their financial parasite. They knew they could not ask me to co-sign. They knew I would demand to see business plans, profit and loss projections, and collateral audits. They knew I would tear Jamal's restaurant fantasy to shreds within 5 minutes of reviewing the paperwork. So they bypassed my consent entirely. They weaponized their access to my old documents and stole my identity, fully believing that family loyalty would force me to cover for them once the crime was committed. They gambled my entire future on the assumption that my fear of public embarrassment would outweigh my desire for justice. They thought my lifelong conditioning as the compliant, invisible daughter would hold strong. I looked at the clock in the corner of my screen. It was 4 in the morning. The rage that had been simmering in my chest all night had burned away, leaving behind a cold, clinical focus. I closed the background files on Jamal and Alyssa. Their past failures were irrelevant now. The only thing that mattered was the present crime. I opened a new secure spreadsheet and titled it Alyssa's Dream Audit. I pulled my hair back into a tight ponytail, grabbed my reading glasses, and cracked my knuckles. The sun was beginning to rise over the Atlanta skyline, casting a pale gray light through my office blinds. My alarm would not go off for another 2 hours, but I was already wide awake and operating at maximum capacity. The investigation has officially begun. The investigation has officially begun. I bypassed my standard morning routine, ignoring the coffee maker and the rising sun, and logged directly into my secure financial monitoring dashboard. As a forensic accountant, I maintain premium subscriptions to all three major credit bureaus, Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. I initiated a comprehensive tri-bureau credit pull, bypassing the consumer-facing summaries and requesting the raw, unedited data files. The progress bar crawled across my screen, each percentage point feeling like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I watched the loading icon spin, taking methodical breaths to steady my racing heart. I needed to see the exact structure of the trap they built around me. When the final report rendered, it glowed on my monitor like a radioactive warning sign. There it sat, nestled maliciously under the active trade lines section. A $1 million commercial installment loan. It was backed by the Small Business Administration and issued by a prominent regional bank headquartered right here in Atlanta. The origination date was marked exactly 3 weeks ago, listed as the primary guarantor with full personal liability in the event of default, was my full legal name and my exact social security number. The status was listed as current and open. Seeing the actual numbers rendered in black and white was entirely different from hearing the announcement at church. $1 million. The sheer scale of the debt meant that if this restaurant failed, the bank would not just ruin my credit score. They would garnish my wages. They would seize my investment portfolios. They would force me into bankruptcy and destroy my professional licensing. My parents essentially placed a financial guillotine around my neck and handed the release lever to a serial grifter. The panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced it down, locking it away behind years of professional discipline. My blood ran completely cold, but my hands remained steady. I split my monitors, pulling up the credit report on the left screen and opening a secure investigative portal on the right. I needed to dissect the anatomy of this fraud piece by piece. I started with public records. I logged into the Georgia Secretary of State Business Registry and pulled the corporate filings for the entity named Alyssa's Dream LLC. The search results populated instantly, revealing the corporate charter and the operating agreement filed just over a month ago. I downloaded the PDFs and began to read through the articles of incorporation. The registration documents named Jamal as the Chief Executive Officer and Alyssa as the Chief Operations Officer. My father, Thomas, was listed as the managing partner. I scanned the document for my own name, searching for any indication that they included me as an equity partner in exchange for stealing my identity. My name was nowhere on the corporate charter. I owned 0% of the company. I had 0 voting rights and 0 claim to any potential profits or physical assets. I simply held 100% of the financial liability. It was a masterclass in parasitic structuring designed to extract maximum value from my credit while excluding me from the ownership structure. I leaned back in my office chair, staring at the ceiling as the reality of their malice washed over me. They deliberately engineered a scenario where I would shoulder the entire risk of their entrepreneurial fantasy. If the restaurant magically succeeded, Alyssa and Jamal would reap all financial rewards, and my parents would bask in the glory of their investment strategy. If the restaurant failed, they would simply dissolve the LLC, walk away from the commercial lease, and let the bank come after my personal assets to satisfy the debt. They had insulated themselves completely. I turned my attention back to the loan details listed on my credit report. The SBA loan was structured with the 10-year repayment term at a variable interest rate. The monthly minimum payments were staggering. I ran a quick calculation on my notepad confirming that the monthly debt service alone would consume nearly the entirety of my net income if the liability fell to me. They literally pledged my entire working life to finance imported chandeliers and premium cuts of meat for a restaurant I did not own. The audacity was breathtaking. I began analyzing the requirements for securing a commercial loan of this magnitude through the Small Business Administration. I knew the underwriting process inside and out from conducting legitimate corporate audits. The SBA does not hand over $1 million based on a good credit score. The process requires verified documentation. Underwriters demand comprehensive business plans, financial projections, collateral appraisals, and rigorous identity verification protocols to prevent fraud. The lender must comply with strict Know Your Customer regulations mandated by federal law. They must verify employment history, cross-reference tax transcripts directly with the Internal Revenue Service, and conduct verbal phone interviews with guarantors to confirm their debt obligations. This was not a simple credit card application that could be fraudulently submitted online. This was a complex, multi-layered financial transaction requiring sustained active deception over several weeks. I stared at the screen, my analytical mind racing through the possibilities. How did they convince a regional bank I was an active participant in this venture? How did they satisfy the underwriting team's demand for sensitive financial documents? How did they intercept the mandatory verification calls without me receiving a single notification? They had to have built an intricate system of lies to bypass the automated security measures and human underwriters. The questions mounted, fueling my determination. I needed to see the actual application. I needed to see the exact lies they told the bank and the digital trails they left behind. I closed the public records portal and prepared to dig deeper into the bank's internal systems. The preliminary assessment was complete. The scale of their betrayal was fully quantified. Now I needed to uncover the crime mechanics. I opened a new secure tab. My next objective was gaining direct access to the bank's origination file. Under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, a consumer has the right to demand the documentation associated with any trade line reported to the bureaus. However, waiting for a formal dispute to process would take 30 days. I did not have 30 days. I needed to see their exact methodology right now. I navigated to the regional bank's commercial lending portal and clicked the link for existing account registration. The system prompted me for a social security number and a loan account number, both of which I had just pulled from my credit report. I entered the digits and the screen transitioned to a login portal. They had already created an online profile. I clicked the forgotten password link. The automated system offered two recovery options: an email reset link or answering security verification questions. I chose the security questions. The screen loaded 3 prompts. What was the name of your first pet? What was the street you grew up on? What is your mother's maiden name? I let out a dry, humorless laugh. They were brilliant enough to commit $1 million federal bank fraud, but they were lazy enough to use the default security questions that any family member could bypass in their sleep. I typed in Buster Oakwood Drive in Jenkins. The system accepted the answers instantly and allowed me to establish a new password. I bypassed their digital lock and entered the dashboard of the commercial loan account. The landing page welcomed me as the primary guarantor of Alyssa's Dream LLC. The current balance at exactly $1 million. I navigated straight to the document repository. My mouse hovered over the master origination file, a massive PDF containing the entire history of the underwriting process. I clicked download and opened the document on my secondary monitor. It was an absolute masterpiece of deceit. They had not just forged my signature on a random piece of paper. They had created an entirely synthetic digital identity for me. I scrutinized the contact information section. They had used an old Yahoo email address I created back in my sophomore year of college and abandoned nearly a decade ago. It was an account my mother knew about because I once used it to forward her a recipe. For the contact phone number, they had not used my actual cell phone. Instead, they registered a burner voice over Internet Protocol phone number with a local Atlanta area code. This VoIP number was specifically established to intercept any verification calls from the bank's underwriting department. Whenever a bank representative called to confirm the loan details, the call was routed directly to that burner application on Jamal's or my father's phone. They had essentially built a digital wall between me and the financial institution, ensuring I would never receive a single alert or inquiry. I scrolled down to the income verification section. Commercial loans of this size require comprehensive tax transcripts. My stomach churned as I looked at the uploaded PDFs. They were high-resolution digitized copies of my W-2 forms and my federal tax returns from 3 years ago. I stared at the screen, trying to understand how they obtained these highly sensitive files. Then the memory hit me. When I moved out of my parents' house into my own apartment at 25, I had left a heavy gray metal filing cabinet in their basement. I had assumed my old paperwork was perfectly safe gathering dust in a locked box in my childhood home. I had trusted them. Thomas and Barbara had physically broken into my filing cabinet, stolen my old tax documents, and uploaded them to the bank's portal to prove my income capacity. Next, I examined the personal financial statement. The document detailed my bank account balances, my investment portfolios, and my complete lack of consumer debt. They had clearly estimated my current net worth based on conversations we had over the years. They took the quiet, modest details of my financial success and repackaged them into a weapon to secure their loan. I moved on to the signature pages. In modern banking, physical wet signatures are rarely required. Financial institutions rely on platforms like DocuSign to execute contracts electronically. I scrolled to the final page of the loan agreement, looking for the digital certificate of completion. This is where fraudulent schemes always collapse. Financial criminals often forget that electronic signature platforms record intense metadata. Every time a document is signed, the software logs the exact time, the device information, and the precise IP address of the user executing the signature. I pulled the IP address logged next to my forged signature and ran it through a basic geolocation tracking tool. The results populated on my screen, pinpointing the exact coordinates of the internet service provider. The IP address belonged to my parents' home Wi-Fi network in suburban Atlanta. My father and Jamal had literally sat in the living room where I grew up, logged into the bank's system, and typed my name on a $1 million federal loan agreement using the family internet connection. The final piece of this puzzle was the disbursement record. I needed to see exactly where the $1 million went after the bank approved the fraudulent application. I found the wire transfer confirmation receipt attached to the end of the file. The bank had disbursed the full $1 million into a newly opened commercial checking account. I checked the authorized signers on that receiving account. It was controlled jointly by Jamal and Thomas. My name was completely absent from the disbursement end. They had siphoned the massive liability onto my shoulders while routing 100% of the liquid capital directly into their own hands. The paper trail was flawless in its intended deception, but their execution had left glaring digital fingerprints everywhere. I highlighted the IP addresses, the fake email routing, the VoIP phone numbers, and the stolen tax documents. I saved every single page to an encrypted flash drive, backing it up to a secure cloud server. I had the entire anatomy of the crime documented, quantified, and completely secured. I now possessed a 2-inch thick binder of incontrovertible evidence. I closed the banking portal and shut my laptop. The time for silent investigation was over. I needed to look them directly in the eye. Armed with the proof of their absolute betrayal, I grabbed my car keys and walked out the door. I drove straight to their house to face them. The drive to my parents' house in the affluent Atlanta suburbs took exactly 24 minutes. I did not turn on the radio. I did not roll down the windows. I sat in the absolute silence of my car, letting the cold fury settle into my bones. When I pulled into their wide, manicured driveway, I saw my father's luxury sedan parked perfectly in the center. I grabbed the heavy black binder containing every printed digital footprint, every forged signature, and every IP address log, and walked up to the front porch. I did not knock. I used the spare key I had kept on my keychain for years, turning the lock and stepping into the pristine foyer. The house smelled of fresh coffee and expensive vanilla candles. From the living room, I could hear the upbeat chatter of a morning talk show. I walked down the hallway, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. I rounded the corner and found Thomas and Barbara sitting on their plush white sectional sofa. My father was scrolling through his tablet, sipping from a ceramic mug, while my mother was filing her nails. They looked completely at peace. They looked like two people who had not just committed a massive federal crime against their own flesh and blood. I walked directly to the center of the room and slammed the 2-inch thick binder down onto the glass coffee table. The impact echoed through the high-ceilinged room like a gunshot. My mother gasped, dropping her nail file while my father jolted upright, nearly spilling his coffee. "What on earth is wrong with you, Naomi?" My father demanded, his face instantly flushing with annoyance. "You cannot just barge in here and start throwing things. We are relaxing." That, I said, pointing a rigid finger at the black binder, "is 20 years in federal prison." My father frowned, his annoyance shifting into a guarded caution. "What are you talking about?" I did not raise my voice. I kept my tone as clinical and detached as a prosecuting attorney. "I pulled my tri-bureau credit report this morning. I also bypassed your incredibly lazy security questions on the regional bank portal and downloaded the entire origination file for the $1 million commercial loan you took out for Alyssa and Jamal. I have the IP addresses that trace the digital signatures directly to the router sitting in your home office. I have the synthesized email address. I have the burner phone logs. I know you broke into my old filing cabinet in the basement and stole my tax returns." The color drained from my mother's face so fast she looked physically ill. She stared at the binder as if it were a live explosive. "Naomi, sweetie," she stammered, her hands trembling as she reached toward her chest. "Let me explain. You do not understand the whole picture. Explain wire fraud." I cut her off instantly. "Explain identity theft. Or explain how you thought a certified forensic accountant would not notice $1 million liability attached to her social security number. Did you honestly believe I would just smile and pay the bill when Jamal inevitably bankrupts this restaurant in 6 months?" My father stood up, puffing out his chest. He was trying to use his physical size to intimidate me, a tactic that had worked perfectly when I was a teenager. But I was no longer a scared child seeking his approval. I was a 33-year-old professional who destroyed white-collar criminals for a living. He took a step toward me, pointing a thick finger in my direction. "Now you listen to me, Naomi," he demanded, his voice dropping into a harsh, commanding register. "We are a family. Jamal and Alyssa could not get approved because the banks are biased and their lending practices are completely unfair. We needed a strong guarantor to push the paperwork through. You are not using your credit for anything important anyway. You just sit in your apartment. We are paying the monthly installments. You will not lose a single dime, and your sister gets the future she deserves." "You forged my signature, Dad," I yelled, refusing to back down a single inch. "You stole my tax documents. You committed a felony." My mother suddenly burst into tears. They were not tears of genuine remorse. They were the weaponized, manipulative tears she always deployed whenever she needed to escape accountability. "We did it for your sister Naomi," she wailed, burying her face in her hands. "We did it for her future. Jamal has such brilliant ideas, but nobody will give him a chance. If you go to the police, you will ruin her life. You will send your own mother and father to jail. Is that what you want? To destroy this family over a technicality." "A technicality." I laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that held zero humor. $1 million in fraudulent federal loans is a technicality. You pledged my entire net worth, my career, and my freedom to finance Jamal's delusions of grandeur. Thomas stepped even closer, his face turning an angry mottled red. "You are being completely unreasonable," he growled. "We gave you life. We put a roof over your head for 18 years. You owe this family. If you breathe one single word of this to the bank or the authorities, you are dead to us. Do you hear me?" He leaned over the glass coffee table, his eyes narrowing with pure malice. "You will be completely cut out of this family forever. I will personally make sure the entire church congregation, all of our relatives, and everyone in this community knows exactly who you are. We will tell them you are a vindictive, jealous spinster who sent her own parents to prison simply because she could not stand seeing her younger sister succeed and find a loving husband. You will have absolutely no one left in this world. I looked at the two people standing in front of me. There was no remorse in their eyes. There was no apology for stealing my identity. There was only anger that they had been caught and aggressive manipulation to force my silence. They were holding my place in the family hostage, assuming I was weak enough to capitulate. My mother stepped out from behind the coffee table, her tears drying up as she sensed my hesitation. She shifted from playing the victim to playing the disappointed parent. Naomi, you have always had such a vivid imagination. She sighed, shaking her head. You are blowing this out of proportion. We did not steal anything. We borrowed your credentials because we knew you would say yes if you understood Jamal's vision. We saved you the stress of paperwork. You should be thanking us for including you. Why do you always have to be so difficult and selfish? The gaslighting was textbook. She wanted me to believe that committing a federal felony was an act of parental love. You are tearing this family apart over a piece of paper. Barbara continued, her voice taking on a sharp edge. Your sister cried herself to sleep for years feeling like a failure. Now she finally has a chance to shine, and you want to rip it away from her because you are jealous. You have always been jealous of Alyssa. You want her to be as lonely and miserable as you are. I stood frozen. The psychological warfare was relentless. She knew exactly which buttons to push, weaponizing my deepest insecurities to protect her fraudulent son-in-law. My father crossed his arms, reinforcing the assault. Your mother is right, Thomas growled. You have zero concept of family loyalty. If you go to the bank, you are choosing to destroy us. We will make sure every relative knows you sent your parents to prison out of pure spite. The pastor at our church will turn his back on you. You will be completely alone. They were using the threat of total isolation to break my will. In the past, this strategy would have worked. The fear of being exiled would have forced me to beg for forgiveness. But as I stared into their cold faces, the forensic accountant inside me took complete control. I analyzed their behavior not as a daughter, but as an investigator cornering white-collar criminals. I made a strategic calculation. If I declared war in their living room, they would panic. Jamal would transfer the money offshore before sunset. My parents would declare bankruptcy, hire aggressive attorneys, and leave me holding the bag. The bank would freeze my assets and tie me up in litigation for years while my credit score burned to ashes. I needed the federal government to destroy them, not me. To do that, I needed them to believe they had won. So I decided to give them exactly what they wanted. I let my shoulders slump forward, dropping my aggressive posture. I forced my breathing to become shallow. I blinked rapidly, squeezing out a few strategic tears that rolled slowly down my cheeks. I looked down at the hardwood floor, playing the part of the beaten, compliant daughter they had raised me to be. I let them see the exact image of submission they required. Fine, I whispered, making my voice tremble perfectly. Fine. You win. I will not go to the police. I will not call the bank. But you have to promise me that the monthly installments will be made on time. If my credit score drops by even 1 point, I am going to the authorities. I cannot lose my accounting license over this. Please just promise me you will make the payments. The transformation in their demeanor was absolutely nauseating. The aggressive hostility vanished. Relief washed over their faces, instantly replaced by smug satisfaction. Thomas smirked, adjusting his shirt collar as if he had just won a hard-fought negotiation. See, I told you she would be reasonable, my father said proudly. We are family, Naomi. We take care of each other. You made the right choice today. My mother stepped forward and attempted to pull me into a hug. I stiffened, barely tolerating her arms wrapping around my shoulders. We knew you would come to your senses, sweetie, she murmured, her voice dripping with fake affection. This restaurant is going to be a massive success. Jamal is going to make us all very wealthy, and you will be glad you played a part in it. Now dry your eyes, and let us move past this ugly misunderstanding. I pulled away from her embrace, keeping my gaze lowered to maintain the illusion of defeat. I picked up my heavy black binder from the coffee table, clutching it tightly to my chest like a shield. I will leave you to your morning, I mumbled softly. I need to get ready to their relieved sighs echoing behind me. I opened the front door, stepped out onto the porch, and pulled it shut. The heavy wooden door clicked perfectly into place, sealing them inside their house of cards. When the latch engaged, the performance ended. My fake tears stopped instantly. My posture straightened, and my expression turned to absolute unyielding stone. I walked down the driveway with measured steps. I got into my sedan, threw the binder on the passenger seat, and locked the doors. The air inside the car felt crisp. I did not feel isolated. I did not feel afraid of their excommunication. I felt entirely liberated. They had just given me everything I needed to orchestrate their downfall. I reached into my purse, pulled out my cell phone, and scrolled through my contacts. I did not call the local police department. I tapped a specific name and brought the phone to my ear. I called David. David answered on the second ring. His voice was sharp and professional, carrying the distinct cadence of a former federal prosecutor. I immediately skipped pleasantries. I told him I needed an emergency meeting. I told him my family had executed a $1 million bank fraud using my identity, and I had the digital origination file sitting on the passenger seat of my car. There was a brief silence before David instructed me to cancel my morning appointments and drive directly to his downtown office. I ended the call and pulled out of my parents' subdivision, watching their manicured lawn disappear in my rearview mirror. The adrenaline that spiked during the confrontation was completely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. I needed to ensure that my tactical retreat held up under their scrutiny. In forensic accounting, the most dangerous moment is the period immediately following discovery. When a fraudster realizes they have been exposed, their behavior becomes highly volatile and entirely unpredictable. If I had walked out of that house and immediately filed a police report with the local precinct, the authorities would have treated it as a domestic dispute. The police would have filed a slow-moving report and my parents would have been notified. The moment Jamal and my father sensed an active investigation, they would have scrambled their assets. $1 million in liquid cash is incredibly easy to hide if you know the walls are closing in. Jamal would have wired the funds to shell companies in jurisdictions without extradition treaties. He would have converted the capital into untraceable cryptocurrency. He would have drained the business accounts, declared bankruptcy on the newly formed corporation, and left me exposed to the bank collection agencies. I would have spent the next decade of my life drowning in civil litigation, trying to prove I did not authorize the loan, while Jamal walked away with my financial future tucked into a digital wallet. I could not allow this to become a messy, drawn-out civil dispute. I needed this to be a federal criminal indictment. I needed the absolute full crushing weight of the United States government to come down on them simultaneously. To achieve that, I needed to let them execute their plan. The legal definition of wire fraud becomes significantly stronger when the perpetrators actively use the misappropriated funds across state lines and commit those funds to tangible hard assets. I needed Jamal to sign the commercial lease for the restaurant space, legally binding himself and his fraudulent corporation to a physical location. I needed him to hire contractors, purchase equipment, and sign vendor agreements. I needed the stolen money to be converted into physical evidence that could be seized, cataloged, and used by federal prosecutors to guarantee a conviction. To facilitate their false sense of security, I had to solidify the illusion of my submission. I pulled my car into a coffee shop parking lot halfway to downtown Atlanta, put the vehicle in park, and picked up my phone. I opened the text message thread with my mother. I typed out a message designed to stroke her ego and validate her manipulation. I wrote that I was sorry for overreacting this morning. I told her I was just overwhelmed by the size of the loan, but I trusted her and Dad to make sure Jamal made the payments. I hit send, feeling absolutely nothing. Less than 2 minutes later, my phone vibrated with her reply. My mother sent a message filled with heart emojis praising my maturity. She told me she knew I would come around once I realized this was for the greater good of the family. She added that Alyssa was so excited and that they were all going to look at commercial restaurant spaces that very afternoon. She was completely, totally deceived. She believed she had successfully bullied me into compliance. By playing the role of the fragile, easily intimidated daughter, I had effectively neutralized their panic. They were not going to hide the money, they were going to spend it. I put my car back in drive and merged onto the interstate, heading toward the city center. I spent the remainder of the drive mentally categorizing the evidence I had collected. The synthetic email addresses, the spoofed phone numbers, the forged digital signatures, and the stolen tax transcripts. Every single piece of data was a nail in their collective coffin. I was not just building a defense for my credit score. I was constructing an inescapable financial snare. I knew the upcoming months would require a level of psychological endurance I had never tested before. I would have to attend family dinners and smile while Alyssa bragged about her brilliant business acumen. I would have to sit quiet while Jamal paraded around Atlanta, spending the money he stole from my future. I would have to watch my parents take credit for my sister's success, knowing the entire foundation of their pride was built on my engineered destruction. It would be agonizing, but it was a necessary sacrifice. The longer I allowed them to operate under the delusion of victory, the more devastating their ultimate collapse would be. I navigated through the dense downtown traffic and pulled into the underground parking garage of David Corporate Law Firm. The concrete walls of the structure were cool and dimly lit. I found a parking space near the elevator bank, turned off the engine, and took one final deep breath. I reached over to the passenger seat and picked up the heavy black binder. The weight of it in my hands felt like justice. I stepped out of the car, locked the doors, and walked toward the elevators. The emotional performance was over for the morning. It was time to hand my evidence over to a professional predator and watch him go to work. David's office sat on the 40th floor of a sleek glass skyscraper, offering a sweeping view of the Atlanta skyline. I stepped out of the elevator and walked past the receptionist directly to his corner suite. David was waiting for me. He was a man in his late 40s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a demeanor perfectly suited for dissecting complex financial crimes. During his tenure as a federal prosecutor, he had dismantled massive corporate embezzlement rings and sent dozens of white-collar criminals to federal prison. Now, in private practice, he was the exact weapon I needed. I walked into his office, bypassed the leather guest chairs, and dropped my heavy black binder onto his polished mahogany desk. He did not ask how I was doing. He knew better. He opened the binder and began to read. For 20 minutes, the only sound in the room was the crisp turning of pages and the distant hum of city traffic below. I watched his eyes scan the fake email addresses, the burner phone records, the forged electronic signatures, and the stolen tax transcripts. As he reached the final section detailing the wire transfer into the commercial account controlled by my father and Jamal, David leaned back in his chair and took a deep breath. He removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose before looking at me. "Naomi," David said, his voice deadly serious. "This is not just a simple family dispute over money. By securing a loan backed by the Small Business Administration using fraudulent credentials, they have directly defrauded the federal government. They crossed state lines with the digital wire transfer. This is bank fraud, wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft. The mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines for these combined offenses are absolutely catastrophic." "I know," I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "That is exactly why I am here." David tapped his pen against the binder. "I can draft a cease and desist letter by noon. We can notify the bank immediately, freeze the commercial account, and block any outbound transfers. The bank will flag the loan as fraudulent and launch an internal investigation. Your credit profile will be protected, and Jamal will not be able to access a single dime of that capital." "No," I said instantly. David stopped tapping his pen. He looked at me, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his face. "What do you mean, no?" I leaned forward, resting my hands on the edge of his desk. "If we freeze the account today, the bank simply reverses the transaction. They claw back the funds. Jamal and my father will claim it was a misunderstanding or a clerical error regarding the guarantor paperwork. They will walk away with a slap on the wrist, and they will spend the rest of their lives telling everyone in our community that I sabotaged my sister's future out of spite. I do not want to just stop the loan, David. I want to amputate them from my life completely." David studied my face, realizing the absolute depth of my resolve. "What is your play, Naomi?" "I want them to spend the money," I explained, laying out the strategy I had formulated during my drive. "I want them to sign the commercial lease for the restaurant. I want Jamal to hire contractors, purchase equipment, and sign vendor agreements. I want the stolen funds to be converted into physical, tangible assets." If they commit the funds to hard assets, they build an inescapable paper trail of misappropriation. I want the FBI to track every single transaction until the evidence is so overwhelming that a federal prosecutor will not even offer them a plea deal. A slow, terrifyingly brilliant smile spread across David's face. You want to let them build the gallows. Exactly, I said. We report the identity theft to the bank's internal fraud division and the FBI today. But we ask them to monitor the accounts quietly. We let Jamal and Alyssa operate under the delusion that they have won. I already sent my mother a text message apologizing for my reaction and giving them my fake blessing. They think I am too weak to fight back. David picked up his desk phone. I have a contact at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically in the Financial Crimes Division. They love cases where the suspects do all the hard work of documenting their own guilt. We will hand them this binder on a silver platter. The bank will establish a silent watch on the business accounts, flagging every outbound wire, every debit card swipe, and every cash withdrawal. He dialed the number, and while it rang, he covered the receiver with his hand. You realize what this means for you, Naomi. You are going to have to play the role of the supportive sister for months. You will have to sit at family dinners and listen to them brag about the restaurant they are building with your stolen identity. You cannot break character. If they suspect you are cooperating with federal authorities, they will destroy the evidence. I can handle it, I assured him. I have spent 33 years pretending to be the invisible, compliant daughter. I can do it for a few more months to secure my absolute freedom. David nodded as his contact answered the phone. For the next hour, I sat in his office and provided a detailed briefing to the federal agent on the other end of the line. We outlined the scope of the fraud, the identities of the perpetrators, and the specific mechanics of the electronic forgery. The FBI agent agreed to the strategy. They would initiate a quiet investigation coordinating with the bank to monitor the flow of the stolen $1 million without alerting my family. When the call ended, David closed the binder and locked it inside a fireproof safe behind his desk. The trap is officially set, he told me. Now all we have to do is wait for Jamal to do what he does best. We wait for him to be arrogant, greedy, and incredibly stupid. I left David's office and stepped back out into the bustling streets of downtown Atlanta. The sun was shining brightly, and the city was alive with the chaotic energy of a weekday afternoon. The towering glass buildings reflected the light, casting long shadows across the pavement. I walked toward my car, feeling a profound sense of calm wash over me. My credit score was temporarily a hostage, but the rescue operation was fully armed and waiting in the shadows. I unlocked my door and slid into the driver's seat. The coming weeks were going to require absolute perfection. I had to become the ultimate actress. I would need to endure Jamal's insufferable boasting, Alyssa's unearned arrogance, and my parents' suffocating hypocrisy. Every family gathering would be a test of my endurance. But knowing the FBI was watching their every financial move gave me an armor of pure steel. I was no longer a victim waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was an undercover informant operating inside my own family, waiting for the perfect moment to detonate their lives. The silent war had officially been authorized. The next 4 months were a masterclass in psychological endurance. I sat at my parents' dining room table eating roast chicken, while Jamal mapped out his culinary empire on a whiteboard. I listened to Alyssa brag about her visionary leadership style, completely unfazed by the fact that she had never managed a single employee in her life. And every single night I went home, opened my encrypted laptop, and reviewed the secure alerts David forwarded from the federal investigators. The FBI was watching every single digital transaction they made, and Jamal, true to his incredibly arrogant nature, simply could not help himself. He was a textbook narcissist, with $1 million burning a hole in his pocket, and he treated the commercial loan like a winning lottery ticket. Instead of prioritizing the restaurant's commercial kitchen equipment, securing wholesale vendor contracts, or hiring experienced staff, Jamal's very first purchase was an exercise in pure ego. He walked into a high-end European auto dealership in Buckhead and purchased a brand-new fully loaded Porsche 911. He did not lease it. He bought it outright. When the federal agents flagged the transaction, they found the dealership invoice. Jamal had registered the luxury sports car under the Alyssa's Dream LLC corporate umbrella, explicitly classifying the six-figure purchase as a corporate marketing vehicle. The sheer stupidity of the transaction was breathtaking. The bank underwriters had specifically approved the loan for commercial real estate development, leasehold improvements, and restaurant inventory. Diverting those highly regulated federal funds to purchase a personal luxury vehicle was a direct, undeniable violation of the loan covenant. It was a textbook definition of wire fraud. But Jamal did not stop there. He and Alyssa treated the business checking account like an unlimited personal slush fund. Alyssa decided that her new role as Chief Operations Officer required a complete wardrobe overhaul. Over the course of 3 weeks, she swiped the corporate debit card at luxury boutiques across the city. She spent $40,000 on designer clothes, imported handbags, and diamond accessories, categorizing the transactions in the accounting software as executive uniform expenditures. Then came the utterly absurd culinary research trips to study hospitality. Jamal, Alyssa, and my parents booked first-class flights to Miami. They spent $15,000 over a single weekend, staying in oceanfront penthouses and racking up massive tabs through VIP bottle service at exclusive nightclubs. They expensed every single cocktail, every cabana rental, and every room service order back to the SBA loan account. I sat in my office and read the expense reports David sent over, shaking my head in absolute disbelief. Every swipe of the debit card, every wire transfer, and every fraudulent classification was silently logged, tagged, and added to the rapidly expanding federal indictment file. They were digging a hole so incredibly deep they would never see daylight again. The hardest part was maintaining my cover during their moments of absolute triumph. After they returned from Miami, my parents hosted a lavish backyard barbecue to celebrate the signing of the commercial lease. Jamal arrived in his new Porsche, revving the engine loudly before parking it right on the grass so all the neighbors could see. He stepped out wearing a designer silk shirt, tossing the keys to my father. "Look at that beauty," Thomas Jamal shouted, patting the sleek hood of the sports car. "The business is already paying dividends. We are projecting a massive return on investment within the first quarter. You just have to know how to leverage capital." My father patted Jamal on the back, looking at the car with pure adoration. "You have a gift, son. You see the big picture." Alyssa walked over to me, holding a crystal glass of champagne. She was wearing a new diamond tennis bracelet that I knew cost exactly $8,000 of my stolen credit. She took a sip and looked at my sensible, inexpensive watch. "You know, Naomi," she purred, her tone dripping with fake sympathy, "if you invested your money instead of just hoarding it in a savings account, you could afford nice things too. Jamal could probably give you some pointers on wealth management. You really need to learn how to live a little." I looked at the diamond bracelet. I looked at the Porsche. I looked at my parents enabling this massive criminal enterprise. "I think I am comfortable with my current financial strategy," I replied evenly. "But I am definitely learning a lot by watching you and Jamal operate. It is quite the education." Alyssa smirked, clearly missing the lethal double meaning of my words. "Well, just remember us when you need a reservation at the hottest spot in town. We might be able to squeeze you in." I smiled warmly. "Oh, I guarantee I will have a front row seat to everything that happens." I walked away from her, moving toward the edge of the patio, where the shadows offered a brief moment of absolute privacy. I pulled out my phone. I opened the encrypted messaging application and sent a quick text message directly to David. "The lease is officially signed. The funds are physically committed across state lines. The fraud is now fully materialized." David replied less than a minute later. "The FBI has everything they need. The trap is full." I slipped my phone back into my pocket and grabbed a skewer of grilled vegetables. The incredibly long waiting game was agonizingly slow, but it was finally almost over. They had successfully and completely converted the stolen funds into hard, easily seizable physical assets. They had foolishly crossed multiple state lines. They had engaged in blatant, undeniable misappropriation. The initial preparation phase was entirely complete. The federal government was locking the targets into their sights. Now I just had to prepare myself for the main event. The grand opening was only a few weeks away, and it was going to be the absolute most truly spectacular disaster this family had ever seen. The arrogance peaked exactly 3 weeks before the restaurant's official grand opening. Jamal decided that a standard launch was not sufficient for his newfound status as a culinary visionary. He insisted on hosting an exclusive invite-only VIP tasting event at the partially finished venue. He invited local food influencers, prominent city council members, aggressive venture capitalists, and naturally the entire leadership board of our church. He wanted a massive audience to witness his fabricated greatness. I was, of course, absolutely required to attend. My mother called me twice that morning to ensure I would be there, reminding me that the primary investor needed to show face to maintain the illusion of total family support. I agreed with a perfectly pleasant tone, while silently verifying that the recording application on my phone was fully updated and functional. I arrived at the venue just after 8 o'clock that evening. When I walked through the heavy double doors of Alyssa's dream, the sheer extravagance of the space hit me like a physical blow. The dining room was a monument to stolen wealth. Massive crystal chandeliers imported directly from Italy hung suspended from the high industrial ceilings. Custom crushed velvet booths in a deep, rich emerald green lined the exposed brick walls. The bar was a sprawling masterpiece of imported white marble, stocked with top-shelf liquor that cost more per bottle than my weekly grocery budget. It was undeniably a beautiful space, but every single square inch of it was built entirely on the back of my stolen identity. Every crystal, every velvet cushion, every gleaming brass fixture was a federal crime waiting to be prosecuted. Alyssa greeted me near the hostess stand. She was wearing a stunning form-fitting designer cocktail dress and holding a glass of vintage champagne. Her hair was professionally styled, and she wore a diamond necklace that practically blinded me under the foyer lights. "Naomi, you actually made it," Alyssa said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, as she looked me up and down clearly, judging my standard black blazer and sensible slacks. "I am so glad you are here. The venue is completely packed tonight, so I had to get a little creative with the seating chart. I seated you near the kitchen swinging doors. I know you do not really do well with networking and socializing, so I figured you would prefer to stay out of the way of the important guests." She was intentionally putting me at the overflow staff table, ensuring I was hidden from the wealthy investors and city officials. She wanted to guarantee I did not accidentally mention my boring corporate job and ruin their high society aesthetic. I smiled warmly, showing no sign of offense. "That is perfectly fine, Alyssa," I replied smoothly. "You know I love observing from the background. It gives me a great perspective on how the entire operation runs." She patted my arm condescendingly and glided away to greet a local television anchor. I navigated through the crowded, noisy room and took my seat at the small table near the kitchen. The vantage point was actually flawless. I had a clear, unobstructed view of the entire dining room, and more importantly, I had a direct line of sight to the massive mahogany bar where Jamal was holding court. Jamal was entirely in his element. He wore a custom-tailored burgundy suit, holding a snifter of expensive scotch. I was surrounded by a tight circle of local businessmen and potential investors. He was speaking loudly, gesturing expansively with his free hand, completely intoxicated by his own perceived brilliance. I watched him for 45 minutes. I waited patiently until the free-flowing alcohol sufficiently lowered his already non-existent inhibitions. When I saw him lean in close to a group of 3 younger investors, his voice carrying that distinct, boastful cadence he used when trying to impress people with money, I knew the moment had arrived. I stood up from my hidden table and navigated the crowded floor. I slipped my phone out of my pocket, unlocked the screen, and hit record on the voice memo application. I walked casually toward the bar, stopping on the opposite side of a large decorative concrete pillar. I was entirely out of Jamal's line of sight, but I was standing less than 4 feet away from him. The acoustics of the high-ceilinged room amplified his booming voice perfectly. "Yeah, man, you just have to know how to play the system." Jamal was bragging loudly, his words slightly slurred from the expensive scotch. "These commercial banks are incredibly stupid. They thought they were giving us $1 million for commercial ovens and dining chairs. I pulled 100 grand out in cash on day one just to secure the Porsche. You have to look like money to make money. It is all about shuffling the assets around the ledger." One of the investors chuckled, sounding slightly nervous. "But does the bank not require itemized receipts for the equipment purchases? Do they not audit the disbursement?" Jamal laughed a deep, arrogant sound that echoed off the marble bar. Man, please. The bank never checks once the ink is dry. As long as you generate fake invoices from a shell company, the automated underwriting software clears the flag. My father-in-law set up a dummy vendor account for the kitchen supplies. We funneled the cash straight through it to cover the luxury expenses. We are basically playing with house money and the bank is too blind to notice. I stood frozen behind the pillar, my thumb hovering over the stop button on my phone. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I hit stop. I sent the audio file directly to my encrypted cloud drive. I stepped away from the pillar, blending seamlessly back into the flow of the party guests. The waiting game was officially over. The trap was completely full and permanently secured. Exactly 2 weeks later, the highly anticipated night of the restaurant's grand opening finally arrived. Jamal ensured absolutely everyone in the entire city of Atlanta knew about it. He bled the stolen loan funds dry to manufacture the illusion of a culinary empire. As I parked my sedan down the street, massive searchlights illuminated the dark Georgia sky like a Hollywood movie premiere. A red carpet rolled across the sidewalk, flanked by velvet ropes and security guards. I stepped out of my car. I did not wear my gray work suit tonight. I wore a sharply tailored blood-red business suit. I paired it with black stiletto heels and a dark, dramatic lip color. Tonight I was not the invisible, compliant older sister. Tonight I was the executioner, and I dressed for the occasion. I walked down the busy street, my high heels clicking rhythmically against the cold concrete. The sidewalk outside Alyssa's dream was swarming with people. Local food critics, clutching notepads, lifestyle influencers, recording videos on their phones, and prominent church members dressed in their Sunday best were all vying for a spot inside. A photographer stood near the entrance, snapping rapid-fire pictures of local minor celebrities as they posed in front of a custom floral wall bearing the restaurant's logo. I did not wait in the line. I walked straight past the velvet rope, completely ignoring the hostess who attempted to ask for my reservation name. I pushed through the heavy glass double doors and stepped into the main dining room. The place was packed to absolute capacity. Smooth, upbeat jazz music played softly over the state-of-the-art sound system, providing a sophisticated backdrop to the loud chatter of Atlanta's elite. Waiters in crisp white aprons navigated through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with premium champagne flutes and delicate hors d'oeuvres. The smell of expensive truffle oil and seared steak filled the air. It was the absolute pinnacle of artificial success. I stood silently near the back of the crowded room, folding my arms across my chest. I scanned the crowd and very quickly spotted my parents. Thomas and Barbara were holding court near the center of the room, dressed in extravagant evening wear. My father wore a custom-tailored tuxedo, and my mother wore a glittering floor-length gown that I knew cost thousands of dollars. They were shaking hands with a local city councilman, beaming with intense manufactured pride. A sudden sharp tapping sound echoed through the room. My father had stepped onto a small elevated stage near the back of the dining room, tapping a silver spoon against his champagne glass. The jazz music faded to a whisper, and the crowd slowly quieted down, turning their attention toward the stage. Jamal and Alyssa joined my parents on the platform. Alyssa looked radiant, wearing a custom silk dress and wiping away a delicate, perfectly practiced hair. Jamal stood beside her, looking out over the crowd with a smug, self-satisfied grin. He adjusted his expensive watch, making sure the sparkling diamonds caught the overhead lighting. "Ladies and gentlemen," my father announced, his booming voice echoing clearly through the restaurant's premium sound system. "Thank you all for being here tonight to witness the birth of a true legacy." The crowd erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause. My mother leaned into the microphone, placing a dramatic hand over her heart. "We are just so incredibly overwhelmed with emotion," Barbara said, letting her voice crack perfectly to convey deep maternal pride. "Our brilliant daughter Alyssa and our visionary son-in-law Jamal have worked tirelessly to bring this beautiful establishment to life. They have faced obstacles, they have overcome challenges, and they have shown us all what true, relentless entrepreneurial spirit looks like." I listened to their words, feeling a cold, dark amusement settling in my stomach. The obstacles they had overcome were federal lending regulations, and the challenges they faced were successfully forging my electronic signature. Thomas took the microphone back, wrapping a proud arm around Jamal's shoulders. When Jamal came to us with this vision, we knew it was destined for greatness. This restaurant is not just a business, it is a testament to family unity. It proves that when a family stands together, pools their resources, and believes in a shared dream, absolutely nothing is impossible. We are building generational wealth tonight. Jamal nodded solemnly, absorbing the unearned praise like a sponge. The investors in the room clapped loudly, completely unaware that the man on the stage had recently confessed on tape to defrauding the federal government. And we must not forget, Barbara added, her eyes scanning the crowded room until they finally locked onto me standing in the back. We also want to give a very special thank you to our eldest daughter, Naomi, who is here tonight. Naomi waved to the crowd. The spotlight operator swung a bright beam of light over the crowd, illuminating me in my blood-red suit. Hundreds of faces turned to look at me. Naomi believed in her sister's vision so much that she provided the foundational support to make this family dream a reality. My mother continued, her voice dripping with toxic, condescending sweetness. Thank you, Naomi, for supporting your sister's incredible success. The crowd applauded me again. They thought I was the supportive, quiet sibling who had contributed a small personal loan. They had no idea I was the primary guarantor of a massive federal fraud. I did not smile. I did not wave. I simply maintained intense, unbroken eye contact with my mother on the stage, letting the silence stretch. My unwavering gaze caused her triumphant smile to falter, slightly replaced by a sudden fleeting shadow of cold doubt. I slowly raised my left hand and looked down at my watch, noting the precise movement of the sweeping second hand. It was exactly 7:15 in the evening, right on time. The trap was about to spring with absolutely devastating, unstoppable force. The heavy glass front doors of the restaurant did not just open, they were violently shoved apart. The sudden, forceful movement sent a blast of cold night air sweeping through the warm, truffle-scented dining room. Every head in the foyer turned toward the entrance. Walking through the doors was a small army of law enforcement. 6 individuals wearing dark tactical windbreakers marched into the restaurant. Printed across their backs in bold yellow letters were the acronyms FBI and U.S. Marshal. Flanking the federal agents were 2 older men wearing sharp conservative gray suits. These were the senior fraud investigators from the regional bank that had issued the $1 million loan. And walking calmly beside the lead agent was David, my federal economic crimes attorney. He carried a sleek leather briefcase and wore an expression of absolute calculated predatorship. I stepped away from the back wall and walked forward to join them, aligning myself perfectly with the federal strike team. The smooth, upbeat jazz music that had been setting the sophisticated mood was cut off immediately. A uniformed local police officer, who had followed the federal agents inside, simply reached behind the hostess stand and ripped the audio cables straight out of the expensive sound system. The abrupt silence that crashed down over the packed dining room was heavy and suffocating. It was not just quiet. It was a dead, terrified stillness. The cheerful clinking of crystal champagne flutes stopped entirely. The loud, arrogant laughter of local influencers vanished. The wealthy investors, city council members, and food critics froze in place, staring wide-eyed at the tactical windbreakers invading their exclusive VIP event. On the elevated stage, my family stood frozen like statues. Jamal had dropped his hand from Alyssa's waist. His smug, self-satisfied grin melted off his face, replaced by a pale, twitching look of absolute panic. My mother, Barbara, clutched her diamond necklace, her mouth hanging open. My father. Thomas narrowed his eyes, his face flushing with immediate defensive anger. He did not yet realize the sheer magnitude of the catastrophic event unfolding in front of him. He still thought he was the smartest, most powerful man in the room. Thomas and Barbara, the senior FBI agent, commanded, his voice cutting through the dead silence like a serrated knife. Step down from the stage right now. Keep your hands where I can see them. My father's face went from flushed with pride to a deep, furious crimson. He gripped the microphone stand tightly, Excuse me, Thomas shouted back, attempting to use his booming voice to assert dominance over a federal agent. What is the exact meaning of this intrusion? You are trespassing on private property. We are hosting a highly exclusive private event for our family business. You have absolutely no right to barge in here and disrupt our guests. I demand to know who is in charge of this operation. The senior agent did not flinch. He simply pulled a thick folded stack of legal documents from the inner pocket of his tactical jacket and held it up. This property is now an active federal crime scene, the agent stated loudly, ensuring that his voice carried to every single VIP food critic and church member standing in the dining room. We are executing federal warrants for the immediate seizure of all physical and financial assets associated with Alyssa's Dream LLC. Furthermore, we hold active federal arrest warrants for Thomas, Barbara, and Jamal. The charges include aggravated identity theft, wire fraud, bank fraud, and federal conspiracy. The dining room erupted into a symphony of chaotic gasps and frantic whispering. The city councilman, who had been shaking my father's hand just minutes ago, physically backed away from the stage, putting as much distance between himself and my family as possible. The investors who had been listening to Jamal brag at the mahogany bar suddenly looked at each other with expressions of dawning horror. Alyssa let out a piercing, hysterical shriek. The sound echoed painfully off the custom velvet booths and imported chandeliers. "What are you talking about?" Alyssa screamed, her voice cracking as she stomped her high heel on the stage. "Jamal, do something. Call security. Tell them to get out of our restaurant. This is our restaurant. We own this." Jamal did not call security. He did not say a single word. He looked completely paralyzed, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy wooden swinging doors that led to the commercial kitchen. He was calculating the distance to the back exit, visibly preparing to run. But before he could even twitch a muscle toward the kitchen, two heavily armed U.S. Marshals stepped out from behind the marble bar and blocked the double doors. They had secured the perimeter before the main team even walked through the front entrance. Jamal was completely trapped. Thomas marched down the short flight of stairs from the stage, his fists clenched at his sides. He stormed straight toward the line of federal agents, refusing to accept that his manufactured reality was collapsing. "You are making a massive mistake," Thomas yelled, pointing a shaking finger at the lead investigator from the bank. "This is a perfectly legitimate business venture. The loan was approved through proper channels. The paperwork was flawless. My daughter co-signed the commercial loan herself. She agreed to everything. We have her authorization." My father turned his furious gaze away from the federal agent and frantically searched the crowd until his eyes locked onto my bright red suit. He pointed his finger directly at my chest, his face contorted with desperate, aggressive manipulation. "Tell them, Naomi," my father ordered, his voice echoing in the silent restaurant. "Tell these officers right now. Tell them you authorized this loan. Tell them you gave us permission to use your credit. Clear this up immediately before you ruin your sister's grand opening." The entire room turned to look at me. They waited for my response. I looked at my father and smiled coldly. I stepped forward, leaving the safety of the federal agents and closing the physical distance between myself and the man who had raised me. The sharp click of my stiletto heels against the imported Italian marble floor echoed through the dead silence of the dining room. I stopped just inches from my father, refusing to break eye contact. The aggressive, domineering posture he had relied on for 3 decades suddenly looked fragile and pathetic under the harsh glare of the flashing police lights spilling in through the front windows. "I never signed a single piece of paper, Dad," I said, my voice carrying the crisp, authoritative tone of a professional auditor presenting irrefutable findings. "You forged my signature. You physically broke into my filing cabinet and stole my tax documents. You hijacked my social security number to fund a fraudulent restaurant for your golden child and her grifter husband. I did not authorize anything, and I have the digital footprints to prove it." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of elite guests. Cell phones were suddenly raised into the air, camera lenses focused directly on the stage. The local food influencers, who had been invited to promote the grand opening, were now live streaming a federal raid. My mother, Barbara, let out a gut-wrenching wail. The pristine, elegant facade she had carefully maintained all evening completely shattered. She stumbled backward, losing her balance on her high heels, and collapsed against a high-top cocktail table. Her weight tipped the table over, sending a massive silver tray of crystal champagne glasses crashing to the floor. The shattering glass sounded like an explosion, but no one rushed to help her. The guests simply backed further away, eager to avoid being associated with an active crime scene. "You promised you would not say anything!" Barbara screamed, sobbing hysterically as she knelt among the broken glass and spilled champagne. "You promised you would just let us pay the loan. You promised you would not go to the authorities." I looked down at her, feeling absolutely no pity. "I promised nothing," I replied coldly, ensuring my voice carried across the room. "I let you believe you had won, so you would feel comfortable. I let you build your entire fake culinary dream, so I could legally and completely demolish it. The bank fraud division has been actively monitoring your business accounts for the past 4 months. Every single transaction has been logged by the federal government." I turned my gaze toward the stage-locking eyes with Jamal. He looked like he was going to be physically sick. The confident, boastful CEO persona had completely evaporated, leaving behind a terrified man who knew he was caught. "They know about the brand new Porsche you bought with commercial loan funds, Jamal," I stated loudly, making sure the venture capitalists in the room heard every word. "They know you registered a luxury sports car as a corporate marketing vehicle. They know about the $40,000 Alyssa spent on designer clothes using the business debit card. They know about the $15,000 luxury vacation to Miami that you falsely classified as culinary research. There is no misunderstanding here. You committed textbook wire fraud, and you did it using my stolen identity." David, my attorney, stepped forward, flanked by the two senior bank investigators. He opened his sleek leather briefcase and extracted a thick stack of legal injunctions. He handed the first document to the lead FBI agent. "As of 7 o'clock this evening, a federal judge has signed a comprehensive asset freeze," David announced to the room, his voice projecting absolute authority. "Every bank account associated with Alyssa's Dream LLC has been locked. The merchant services accounts have been terminated. The commercial lease agreement has been voided due to fraudulent execution. The vehicles, the kitchen equipment, the imported furniture, and every single bottle of liquor behind that bar are now the property of the federal government pending asset forfeiture." Alyssa slumped onto the floor of the stage, her custom silk dress pooling around her as she wept uncontrollably. Her mascara ran down her face in thick black streaks. She looked up at my parents, her voice breaking. "Mom, Dad, do something. Tell them to stop. They cannot take my restaurant. This is my dream." Thomas tried to speak, but his voice completely failed him. He finally realized that his loud voice and physical intimidation meant absolutely nothing against federal indictments. The lead FBI agent stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. He grabbed my father's right arm, twisting it firmly behind his back with practiced efficiency. "Thomas, you are under arrest for aggravated identity theft and bank fraud," the agent recited calmly as the steel cuffs clicked securely into place. Two more agents moved toward my mother, pulling her up from the broken glass and securing her wrists behind her back. The reality of the situation crashed down upon the dining room. The VIP guests, the local politicians, and the church leadership were watching upstanding community members being hauled away in handcuffs. I stood in my blood-red suit, my posture perfectly straight, watching the empire they built on my back crumble into dust. The federal agents then turned their attention toward the stage, walking deliberately toward Jamal, who was frantically backing away until his shoulders hit the back wall. The investors who had believed his lies shook their heads in utter disgust, realizing they had narrowly avoided becoming entangled in a massive criminal enterprise. Jamal looked around wildly, seeking any possible avenue of escape, but the armed marshals blocking the kitchen doors made it painfully clear that his charade was completely finished. He was trapped by his own insurmountable greed. The true betrayal was about to begin as the agents prepared to read him his rights in front of the entire audience. His collapse was entirely self-inflicted and completely satisfying. The grand opening was finally over. The federal agents moved onto the elevated stage, their heavy boots thudding rhythmically against the polished wood. Jamal pressed his back firmly against the decorative brick wall. his hands raised in front of his chest in a posture of frantic surrender. The custom-tailored burgundy suit that had given him so much artificial confidence just minutes ago now looked like a costume he was desperately trying to shed. Sweat beaded profusely on his forehead, catching the harsh glare of the flashing police lights illuminating the street outside. "Jamal, put your hands behind your back," the lead FBI agent ordered, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. "You are being placed under arrest for federal wire fraud and conspiracy to commit bank fraud." The metallic click of the handcuffs unlocking echoed sharply through the silent dining room. That precise sound shattered whatever fragile delusion Jamal was still clinging to. The self-proclaimed culinary visionary, the man who had confidently mocked my corporate job and lectured me on building generational wealth, completely broke. He did not ask for a lawyer. He did not invoke his right to maintain silence. He instantly and viciously turned on the very people who had sacrificed my future to build his empire. "I did not know anything about stolen identities," Jamal screamed, his voice cracking with sheer, unfiltered panic. He violently thrust his finger toward my father, who was already restrained by two armed agents. "Thomas did it. He brought me all the paperwork. He told me the loan was completely clean. He told me Naomi signed the guarantor forms willingly. I was just the operations manager. I had absolutely no idea they forged her signatures." My father whipped his head around, staring at his son-in-law with an expression of absolute horrified betrayal. "You cowardly parasite!" Thomas roared, struggling uselessly against the tight grip of the federal marshals. "You begged me to find the funding. You told me you would lose the commercial lease if we did not secure the capital immediately. You knew exactly where every single dollar of that money came from." Jamal ignored my father entirely, shifting his frantic, wide-eyed gaze directly to the lead investigator. "I want immunity," Jamal yelled, his chest heaving heavily as he backed further away from the advancing agents. "I will tell you everything they did. I will give you every single password to the cloud accounting software. I will testify against Thomas and Barbara in federal court. They orchestrated the entire scheme. They manipulated the bank documents. I am just a victim of their financial deception." Alyssa, who was still slumped on the floor of the stage in her ruined silk dress, looked up at her husband in sheer disbelief. The man she had defended, the man she had elevated above her own sister, was publicly offering to send her parents to a federal penitentiary just to save his own skin. "Jamal, how could you say that?" Alyssa wailed, her voice thick with devastation and shock. "You are my husband. You spent the money. You took out $100,000 in cash on the very first day. You bought a luxury sports car with the business funds." Jamal glared down at his wife, his face contorted with a vicious, cornered desperation. "To secure my executive image," Jamal yelled back at her, completely unhinged. "This is your family's mess. You told me the capital was secured through a legitimate family trust. You told me Naomi was happy to be a silent partner. You lied to me, Alyssa. You set me up to take the fall for your parents' criminal activities." It was a spectacular, pathetic display of rapid self-destruction. In less than 3 minutes, the perfect unified family had completely turned on each other. They were tearing each other apart right on the stage, eagerly offering each other up to the federal government to avoid the inevitable prison sentences. The loyalty they had weaponized against me my entire life proved to be entirely conditional, dissolving the instant they faced actual legal consequences. The federal agents did not entertain Jamal's desperate negotiation. They grabbed his arms, spinning him around and slamming him face first against the brick wall. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked securely around his wrists, binding his hands tightly together. "You can discuss your cooperation agreement with the United States Attorney," the lead agent said coldly, hauling Jamal backward away from the wall. "Right now you are going straight to the Federal Detention Center." The commanding officer turned to the remaining law enforcement personnel stationed near the front entrance. "Clear the building," he ordered loudly. "Get these civilians out of here. We need to lock down the premises and secure the physical assets for the forfeiture unit immediately." The evacuation of Alyssa's dream was swift and merciless. The wealthy investors, the local politicians, and the prominent church members filed out of the double doors in shocked, fearful silence. They held their phones tightly, texting and whispering, eager to distance themselves from the radioactive scandal unfolding before them. The reputation my parents had murdered my financial future to build was entirely obliterated in a single devastating night. I stood my ground near the center of the room, my arms folded across my chest, watching the agents march my family toward the exit. My father went first, his head bowed, his face a mask of furious humiliation. Jamal followed, trembling and muttering frantic excuses to the stoic agent escorting him. Then came my mother. As Barbara was led past me, her wrists bound tightly in steel, she stopped for a brief second. She looked at me with venomous, hateful eyes, her tear-stained face twisted in pure rage. "You are an absolute monster," she spat, her voice dripping with venom. "You destroyed your own family." I looked back at her, feeling no anger, no sadness, and no regret. I felt only the cold, precise satisfaction of a perfectly balanced ledger. "No, Mom," I said softly, ensuring only she could hear the final judgment. "I just audited you. You destroyed yourselves." The agents pulled her forward, marching her out into the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers waiting on the dark Atlanta street. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind them, sealing their fate. I turned around and walked out into the cool night air, breathing freely for the first time in my life. The sunrise over Atlanta. The next morning felt remarkably crisp. I woke up in my own bed at exactly 6 o'clock, completely bypassing my usual alarm. There was no lingering anxiety in my chest, and no frantic urge to check my credit report. I brewed a pot of dark roast coffee, poured it into a ceramic mug, and opened my laptop on the kitchen island. I did not log into my secure banking portal today. Instead, I opened the local news websites. The fallout was absolute and immediate. The lead story on the front page of the local paper featured a massive high-definition photograph of my parents being shoved into the back of a federal transport vehicle. The headline was printed in bold, unforgiving text. "Prominent church family arrested in million-dollar commercial bank fraud." The digital article detailed every humiliating aspect of the raid. The journalist described the shattered crystal on the floor, the terrified investors fleeing the scene, and Jamal screaming his confession to the federal agents. The local morning television stations were already running footage of the restaurant taken from the street. The heavy glass double doors of the building were chained shut and secured with a heavy-duty federal padlock. A bright orange notice from the United States Marshals Service was plastered directly across the custom-painted logo on the front window, declaring the property seized pending asset forfeiture. The velvet ropes had been kicked over and left in the gutter. The red carpet was stained and trampled. The dream was officially dead and buried. My cell phone began to vibrate violently on the kitchen counter. The caller ID showed a frantic succession of numbers belonging to aunts, uncles, and members of my parents' church congregation. The same people who had smiled and applauded my forced generosity just months ago were now desperately seeking gossip. I silenced the phone and tossed it into a drawer. I had no intention of fielding their frantic questions. I poured myself a second cup of coffee and logged into the county property records database. Because my father and Jamal had thrown each other under the bus instantly, the federal investigators did not waste a single second. The bank had moved with lethal corporate efficiency. To secure the initial deposit and the working capital needed to float the restaurant before the main federal loan dispersed, Thomas and Barbara had made a fatal miscalculation. They had put their own house up as collateral for a secondary commercial line of credit. They had leveraged the very roof over their heads to fund Alyssa's designer wardrobe and Jamal's luxury sports car. Now that the primary loan was flagged for severe federal fraud, the bank invoked the cross-default clause buried deep in the loan agreement. The foreclosure was not going to be a slow, drawn-out process involving warning letters and grace periods. Because the collateral was tied directly to an active federal crime, the bank accelerated the repossession. By 9 o'clock in the morning, a legal notice of default was filed with the county clerk. By noon, a team of bank-appointed property managers arrived at my parents' manicured suburban estate. The neighbors who had previously envied my mother's perfect landscaping now stood on their front porches, watching a crew of men change the locks on the heavy oak front door. My parents lost their home, their freedom, and their carefully curated standing in the community in a span of less than 12 hours. Everything they had built their entire identity around was completely stripped away, leaving them with nothing but the reality of their own extreme greed. I tracked the legal filings from my secure home office, watching the judicial system systematically dismantle their lives piece by piece. While Thomas, Barbara, and Jamal sat in federal holding cells waiting for their arraignment hearings, Alyssa faced a different kind of nightmare. Alyssa miraculously avoided being physically arrested during the raid because her signature was not on the primary fraudulent loan documents. My parents had deliberately kept her name off the federal paperwork to protect her, pushing all the risk onto me. But her punishment was perhaps the most poetic justice of all. Jamal filed for divorce directly from federal lockup. He instructed his court-appointed attorney to draft the separation papers less than 24 hours after the arrest. He was desperately trying to distance himself from the family he had just scammed, hoping to leverage his cooperation with the authorities into a reduced sentence. He abandoned Ella, instantly leaving her completely alone to face the catastrophic financial ruin they had created together. Before the raid, Alyssa had fully embraced her role as the chief operating officer. She had proudly signed personal guarantees with over a dozen restaurant suppliers. She signed her own name on the contracts for the custom commercial ovens, the imported chandeliers, the designer velvet booths, and the premium liquor shipments. With the business bank accounts permanently frozen and seized by the federal government, those suppliers could not collect their payments from the corporate entity. Instead, they came directly after Alyssa personally. She was left holding the bag for over $300,000 in personal civil debt. The golden child, who had never worked a hard day in her entire life, was now legally responsible for a mountain of commercial invoices. The creditors began calling her cell phone relentlessly. They sent collection agents to her luxury apartment, demanding payment for the extravagant lifestyle she had flaunted on social media just days prior. Alyssa was forced to pack whatever belongings she could fit into a few trash bags and flee the luxury building before the landlord initiated eviction proceedings. She had no husband to bail her out, no parents to drain their savings for her, and absolutely no credit left to leverage. She was completely destitute. I sat down at my kitchen counter, finally letting myself process the absolute and total perfection of the trap I had successfully built. The legal machinery of the federal government moved with a ruthless mechanical efficiency that left no room for negotiation or mercy. Within 48 hours of the raid, the United States Attorney's Office formally handed down the federal indictments. I sat in the polished gallery of the federal courthouse, wearing a sharp black trench coat, watching the arraignment hearings unfold. My parents, Thomas and Barbara, were led into the courtroom, wearing standard-issue orange jumpsuits, their wrists and ankles bound by heavy transport chains. The sight of them shuffling toward the defendant's table, stripped of their designer clothes and their manufactured dignity, was a stark testament to the gravity of their crimes. The federal prosecutor stood before the judge and read the charges into the official record. They were indicted on 1 count of conspiracy to commit bank fraud, 2 counts of wire fraud, and 1 count of aggravated identity theft. Because the victim of the identity theft was a direct family member, and because the fraud involved a federal lending institution, the prosecutor aggressively opposed bail. He argued that my parents were a flight risk and possessed the manipulative capacity to tamper with witnesses. The judge agreed. The gavel slammed down, denying bail and remanding Thomas and Barbara to federal custody pending trial. My mother let out a strangled, breathless cry as the marshals pulled her away from the table, dragging her back to a holding cell where she would sleep on a thin plastic mattress. Jamal's arraignment followed immediately after. He marched into the courtroom looking absolutely terrified, his eyes darting frantically toward the prosecutor. True to his cowardly nature, Jamal's defense attorney immediately submitted a formal proffer agreement to the court. Jamal was officially pleading guilty to a reduced charge of wire fraud in exchange for testifying against my parents. He had surrendered his passport, his remaining assets, and any claim to the restaurant equipment. But the most calculating move Jamal made was not in federal court, it was in family court. While sitting in his detention cell, Jamal had successfully expedited his divorce filings against Alyssa. He legally severed their marriage with surgical precision, officially abandoning her to absorb the massive financial shockwave alone. In the divorce filings, Jamal's attorneys argued that the business debts were incurred solely under Alyssa's name and signature, absolving him of any civil liability for the unpaid vendors, the golden couple, who had strutted through my parents' church, bragging about building generational wealth, were now completely annihilated. Jamal traded his wife's financial future for a slightly reduced prison sentence. Alyssa's descent into absolute poverty was rapid and entirely unmitigated. Without my parents' home to retreat to, and without Jamal's stolen funds to support her lifestyle, she was completely exposed to the harsh reality of the working class. The civil lawsuits from the restaurant suppliers piled up with terrifying speed. Process servers tracked her down relentlessly, handing her thick stacks of litigation paperwork for the unpaid commercial ovens, the custom velvet booths, and the imported chandeliers. Because she had signed personal guarantees for over $300,000 in equipment, the creditors successfully garnished the very few assets she had left. They emptied her personal checking account. They seized her designer jewelry and the expensive handbags she had purchased during her fraudulent Miami shopping spree. With no money, a gutted credit score, and an impending bankruptcy on her record, Alyssa was forced to abandon her high society facade. She moved into a tiny, rundown studio apartment in a dangerous neighborhood on the outskirts of Atlanta. She had to sell her remaining clothes to a consignment shop just to afford the first month's rent and the security deposit. The girl who had never worked a single grueling hour in her life, who had totaled a brand new car and received a luxury SUV as a reward, was suddenly forced to enter the labor market with absolutely zero marketable skills. I received the updates on her living situation through mutual acquaintances who could not resist sharing the gossip. Alyssa applied for dozens of corporate jobs, still believing she was entitled to a management position because she had briefly called herself a chief operating officer. Every single corporate recruiter threw her resume directly into the trash the moment they ran a background check and saw her connection to a massive, highly publicized federal bank fraud. With no other options, Alyssa swallowed her enormous pride and took a minimum wage job as a shift manager at a greasy fast food drive-thru. She spent her days wearing a polyester uniform, smelling of stale fryer oil, taking orders from impatient customers who did not care about her past illusions of grandeur. She took the bus to work because she could no longer afford a vehicle. She spent her nights sitting in a cramped, unheated apartment, fielding harassing phone calls from aggressive debt collectors who demanded money she would never be able to earn. The irony was absolute perfection. My mother had once mocked my career, claiming that my sensible life was boring and pathetic compared to Alyssa's visionary path. Now Alyssa was trapped in a cycle of poverty so deep that she would spend the next decade of her life just trying to reach a zero balance. The federal indictments against my parents moved toward the trial phase, but Thomas and Barbara quickly realized they had absolutely no defense. The evidence I had gathered was entirely bulletproof. The IP addresses, the forged digital signatures, and the stolen tax transcripts left no room for reasonable doubt. Faced with the reality of a lengthy trial and the overwhelming probability of a maximum sentence, my father's expensive defense attorney advised them to take a plea deal. They were forced to admit their guilt on the public record. They had to stand in a federal courtroom, look a judge in the eye, and confess that they had stolen their oldest daughter's identity out of pure, unadulterated greed. The collapse of their empire was complete, and the stage was set for the final permanent severance of our bloodline. 3 weeks after my parents entered their guilty pleas, securing the permanent severance of our bloodline, the past made one final pathetic attempt to drag me back into the dirt. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, the receptionist at my corporate office building called my desk. She sounded frantic, explaining that a woman claiming to be my sister was causing a massive disruption in the main lobby. Alyssa had somehow bypassed the outer security perimeter by crying hysterically, begging building management to let her see me. I could have instructed security to throw her out onto the wet pavement, but I knew she would just keep returning. I needed to extinguish this fire permanently, face to face. I told the receptionist I would handle it and took the elevator down to the cafe. When I walked into the lobby, I barely recognized her. The arrogant woman who wore an $8,000 diamond tennis bracelet to mock my sensible watch was completely gone. Alyssa looked terrible. Her designer clothes were replaced by a cheap wrinkled sweater and faded jeans hanging loosely on her frame. Her hair was unkempt, and her face was puffy from chronic crying. She looked utterly crushed by the real world. The moment she saw me approaching, she lunged forward, grabbing my hands across the small circular cafe table before I could even pull out a chair. "Naomi, please!" she sobbed, her voice cracking as tears spilled down her cheeks. "You have to help me. I am drowning. The creditors will not stop calling me. They are garnishing my wages at the drive-thru. I cannot even afford to keep the heat on in my apartment. Mom and Dad are facing 5 years in federal prison. You have the power to talk to the judge. You can ask for leniency. You can tell them it was all Jamal's fault. Please, I am your sister. We share the same blood." I slowly and deliberately pulled my hands out of her frantic grasp. I sat down in the chair opposite her, keeping my posture perfectly straight. I looked at her, searching my own chest for any lingering trace of sympathy. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no anger, no pity, and no sadness. There was only an empty clinical clarity. I was looking at a stranger who had tried to steal my life. "Alyssa," I said, my voice as even and cold as a winter morning. "When you sat at that expensive steakhouse drinking wine bought with my stolen identity, and told me that my pristine credit score belonged to you because I was single and had no legacy, did you care about being my sister then? When you racked up $40,000 in designer handbags on a fraudulent business account, did you ever stop to think about the federal prison sentence you were building for me?" She choked on a harsh sob, shaking her head frantically. "I was stupid. I did not know the details. Jamal manipulated me. He told me it was all perfectly legal family money." "You loved it," I corrected her, instantly refusing to let her play the victim. "You loved taking from me. You loved looking down on me. You loved being the golden child so much that you did not care if my entire financial future was burned to ashes, just to keep you warm. You were perfectly happy to let me be the collateral damage of your grand culinary empire." "I am so sorry," she wailed, burying her face in her hands. "I have lost everything. I have nothing left." "I do not forgive you," I said simply, the finality of the words hanging heavy in the quiet coffee shop. "And I am absolutely not helping you. I am not writing a leniency letter to the federal judge for Mom and Dad. I am not lending you a single dime to pay your civil judgments. You wanted to be a chief operating officer, Alyssa. You wanted to be a corporate executive. Well, executives deal with the consequences of their financial liabilities. Consider this your very first lesson in real-world business." I stood up, adjusted my tailored suit jacket, and looked down at her one last time. "Do not ever come to my office or contact me again," I instructed. "Have a good life." I walked away, leaving her crying uncontrollably into her cup of cold coffee. I stepped back into the secure elevator, swiped my employee badge, and rode back up to my floor. I never looked back. That was the final time I ever saw or spoke to my sister. 6 months later, my firm recognized the meticulous, ironclad way I had handled my own complex federal fraud case. They realized that an accountant who could successfully audit and dismantle her own family's criminal enterprise possessed a rare level of ruthless precision. I was officially promoted to Director of Risk Management, complete with a massive salary increase and a corner office overlooking the city. I used my pristine, fully protected credit score and my substantial new income to purchase a beautiful new home in a quiet, upscale neighborhood. I decorated it exactly the way I wanted. I sleep incredibly well at night knowing my perimeter is perfectly secure. Sometimes the people who share your DNA are just parasites disguised as family. They will drain your resources, demand your unwavering loyalty, and manipulate your empathy, all while calling it love. Cutting them out is not cruel. It is basic survival. When toxic people try to use guilt to extract your resources, remember this. Blood does not entitle anyone to your future. You are allowed to set rigid boundaries. You are allowed to enforce severe consequences. And when they build a fraudulent house of cards on top of your back, you are absolutely allowed to step aside and watch the entire structure collapse. Thank you for listening to my story. If this narrative resonated with you, Please leave a comment sharing your own experiences with toxic family dynamics and financial manipulation. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of standing up, fighting back, and reclaiming your life. Stay strong, trust your instincts, and always protect yourself first.